The thing about the Veth that nobody outside the biological memory division talks about, not in the public records, not in the school primers, not in the memorial speeches delivered every 50 years at the seating commemoration, is that we loved them once. Not the way you love something you choose, the way you love a wound that will not close, the way, eventually, you stop trying to close it and start asking what it is teaching you. I was 43 years old when the communion came back. I had spent 19 of those years aboard vessels of one kind or another, and 11 of those years aboard this one, the dreadnought Ardennes, 9,400 meters of layered composite hull and mass driver arrays, and enough reactor core to warm a small moon. I knew the Ardennes the way you know any place you have survived in long enough that it stops being a place and becomes a fact of your life. I knew where the deck plating flexed under your feet in the port hangar. I knew which corridor smelled of coolant and which smelled of the recycled air from the hydroponics level 2 decks below, that faintly green, damp smell that has no analog on the surface, and that I have come to associate so completely with shipboard life that I cannot smell new growth anywhere without feeling, for a half second, like I am back at my station. I knew what the bridge felt like at 300, when the night crew ran quiet and the only light was the soft blue of the tactical displays and the amber glow from the weapons monitoring board at my station. And the stars, if the viewport shutters were open, which on quiet nights they were. I knew the Ardennes. 11 years is long enough. That is where I was when the communion arrived. At my station. 3:14 hours local ship time on the 14th of Ren, which is the name we have given to the second month of the planetary administrative year, a word that comes from a very old root meaning the time of returning, which the calendar committees chose 3,000 years ago for reasons that at the time seemed administrative, and that in retrospect seem like something else. Ren is the month the seating commemoration falls. It has always been the month the seating commemoration falls. The calendar committees knew what they were doing. 55,000 years ago, give or take a century in either direction, the Veth Communion's own year count is imprecise by that much, because they measure time by chemical decay cycles rather than orbital periods, and the margin compounds over long spans. The Veth made their first and only visit to Earth. They did not come with weapons. They did not come with soldiers, in any sense we would recognize. They did not come with the intention to conquer or to destroy or to subjugate. They came with a biological payload, a self-replicating organic compound, engineered across what our analysts believe are roughly 30 million years of iterative development, designed to saturate a planetary biosphere and begin a slow chemical conversion. The managed transformation of a world's living substrate into something the communion could extract and use when they returned on their harvest cycle. The payload was not violent. The Veth did not think in terms of violence. They thought in terms of agriculture. They seeded Earth the way you seed a field. They departed. They set their internal communion cycle to return in 55,000 years, and I blinked to an organism that reproduces over geological time scales and sustains its collective consciousness across a distributed neural network the mass of a gas giant's atmosphere. They moved on. They seeded 14 other worlds during the same extended transit. Earth was not special to them. Earth was plot 7 in a long rotation. The notation they used for it in their biological catalog, which our researchers cracked in year 23,000 of the substrate study period, translates loosely as standard class atmospheric biosphere, moderate complexity, projected substrate receptivity, nominal. Nominal. The 314 alert came from Outer Watch Platform Helen, which sits at the Saturn approach corridor and carries a sensor array capable of detecting a mass transit signature from 40 astronomical units out. The signature was enormous, not in the way that human vessels are enormous, and our largest vessels are very large indeed, but in the way that a weather system is enormous, diffuse, distributed, organic in its distribution. The Veth communion does not travel in ships. The communion travels as the communion, a slow, gravitationally bound collective of biological mass, navigating by chemical consensus, moving through transit space in a formation that our analysts had been modeling for 40,000 years without once losing interest in how it worked. There are careers in the communion dynamics section of the biological memory division. Long careers. The kind of careers where the work itself becomes the reason to keep working. I was at my board within 30 seconds of the alert. The bridge came up fast around me, lights shifting from night mode amber to full operations blue, stations activating in the sequence the crew had drilled 10,000 times across 11 years. The captain, Sierra Dunn, 15 years in command of the Ardennes, the kind of officer who said almost nothing during a crisis because she had already said everything during the preparation for it, was already in her chair when I arrived at my station. She had beaten me by maybe 4 seconds. I do not know how she manages it. I have stopped trying to understand and simply accepted it as one of the Ardennes' facts. The tactical display filled the forward section of the bridge with the resolved signature, a slowly spreading amber field, its leading edge still decelerating, its mass distribution already 4 times the cross-section of Jupiter's disk. The communion's approach vector had been laid in by the tactical system the moment the signature resolved. It matched the original seeding approach track from 55,000 years ago, which we had modeled in precise detail from the communion's own broadcast records, and which had not changed by more than a decimal's worth of angular deviation. Of course it had not changed. The communion does not change. That is one of the 3 things the biological memory division's researchers conclude with certainty after 40,000 years of study. The communion does not change, because change requires individual cognition, and individual cognition is the specific thing the communion optimized away 300 million years before Earth's oceans formed. They are a perfect machine for a single purpose. They are also, in their way, a perfect thing. A living system so completely tuned to its function that looking at it on a display feels less like looking at a predator and more like looking at a tide. "Weapons ready," I said. Standard acknowledgement. My board was already green. It had been green for 11 years, because on the Ardennes we did not treat readiness as something you achieved in response to an alarm. Readiness was the condition. The alarm was just the signal that the condition was about to matter. "Confirmed," the captain said. She did not look at me. She was watching the amber field on the tactical display with an expression I had spent 11 years learning to read. It was not fear. It was not excitement. It was the specific expression of a person who has been solving a problem for 11 years and has just received confirmation that the problem is real, which is not the same as relief, but is close to it in certain ways. I looked at my board. 47 orbital and near-space weapons platforms had come to alert status in the 5 minutes since the signature resolved. The outer system grid, platforms Helen, Savi, Calder, and Ren-3, had locked targeting solutions on the communion's primary node and the 8 major secondary concentrations. The intercept force, of which the Ardennes was the command vessel, comprised 11 dreadnoughts, 32 cruisers, and an indeterminate number of fast attack platforms whose commanders I trusted entirely, and whose positions I tracked as green points at the edge of my secondary display. We were holding at 41 kilometers altitude above the eastern Pacific, in a formation arc that covered the approach corridor from 14 different angles simultaneously. Below us, through the reinforced viewport shutters and 41 kilometers of atmosphere and cloud and cold salt ocean, was Earth. I could not see it at that altitude in any direct sense. I knew it was there the way you know anything at the limit of your instruments, because the readings confirmed it, and because I had grown up on its surface. In a coastal city called Kalen Reach that sits inside the remains of a mountain range reshaped over 40,000 years into something the geological record would not recognize. The mountain my city stands in was not carved by water. It was carved by hands, first human hands working with tools, then machines, then the minds of systems that think faster than hands move. Kalen Reach has a population of 9 million people and a harbor wall 11 kilometers long and a defensive grid that operates continuously and without pause. It is not the largest city on Earth. It is not the most heavily defended installation on Earth. It is one of many. It is average by current standards. That is what the Veth were coming back to. Here is what I knew, standing at my station on the bridge of the Ardennes at 3:14 on the 14th of Ren, that the Veth did not know. The seeding agent, which the Biological Memory Division calls the Veth substrate, and which in the informal records of the first few thousand years of study is called other things, most of them more accurate to the texture of how it was experienced, did not kill us. This was the first surprise. The early researchers, in the centuries immediately following the substrate's introduction to the biosphere, expected it to be lethal in the way that most aggressive biological agents are lethal. It was not. It was more systematic than that. The substrate's design objective was not destruction, but conversion, the transformation of an existing biological substrate into a form the communion could chemically process and extract. It did not kill organisms. It changed them slowly at the cellular level, over the course of what the communion had calculated would be 55,000 years of uncontested conversion. The communion had not planned for resistance. The human immune system encountered the substrate and did what immune systems do. It responded. Inflammation, targeted protein production, adaptive cellular response. The substrate was sophisticated. It had been refined across 30 million years of application, but it had never encountered this particular configuration of immune complexity. Human cellular architecture and the broader architecture of Earth's complex biosphere turned out to be more argumentative than the communion's catalog had prepared for. The substrate pushed against cellular function. The immune system pushed back. The substrate adapted its approach. The immune system adapted its counter. This bilateral escalation ran in every cell of every complex organism on Earth for 3,000 years, which is not a metaphor and is not a simplified summary of a more complicated process. It is a precise description of what happened. 3,000 years of continuous biological argument at the cellular level, body by body, generation by generation, across the entire surface of the planet. The cost of those 3,000 years is documented in the early records of the Biological Memory Division, which are held in the deepest archive level of the Palin Range complex, and which are available to any researcher with the patience to read 40,000 years' worth of inherited annotations. I have not read them. I have read the summaries, and the summaries use clinical language, and the clinical language is a choice that the division's early directors made deliberately, and that every subsequent director has upheld deliberately, because some records are most accurately kept in the language of measurement rather than the language of feeling. The measurements describe a population that experienced 3,000 years of immune-mediated physiological stress, cognitive disruption, and the specific kind of long illness that does not kill quickly, but does not allow you to live without difficulty. And then, in the 32nd century of the substrate period, the human immune system won. Not cleanly, not completely, not in any way that was visible to the people living through the end of that period, who had no way to know they were living through the end rather than the middle. But the substrate had three structural vulnerabilities in its surface chemistry, design choices the communion had made in the substrate's original engineering that were optimized against the prior catalog of seeded worlds, and that turned out, uniquely and irreversibly, to be the wrong choices against this one. The human immune system found those vulnerabilities across 3,000 years of continuous biological pressure, the way water finds the weakness in stone. It found them, and it exploited them, and the substrate went dormant. Not gone. The substrate is still present in every human cell on Earth. You can sequence it out of any tissue sample, and there it is, a long, inert, annotated scar in the deep architecture of human biology, as permanent and as harmless as the genomic record of every other ancient encounter our cellular lineage has accumulated over 4 billion years of evolution, but dormant, contained, beaten. And the immune system that had beaten it was no longer quite the same immune system that had started the fight. This is the part that took another 10,000 years to understand fully, and that the biological memory division considers its central finding. And that is the reason the division exists in the form it does, not as a historical archive, though it is that, but as an ongoing research institution, because the question of what the substrate's defeat produced in human cellular architecture is not a question with a final answer. It keeps producing new answers as the tools for asking it improve, which they have done continuously across 40,000 years, and the division's current senior biologists are confident they will continue to do so for at least 40,000 more. The metabolic changes required to defeat the substrate had cascaded through human biochemistry in ways that extended far beyond immunity. The cognitive disruptions of the substrate period, the strange compression and extension of memory, the shifts in associative processing, the documented changes in how information was organized and retained across generations, had not been random side effects. They had been the immune system pressing against the brain's chemical environment, and the brain adapting to that pressure, and the adaptations becoming heritable, and the heritable adaptations building across 3,000 years of selection pressure into something that the biosphere had not produced before. We did not wake up smarter. That is a simplification and an insult to 40,000 years of labor. What happened was slower and more genuine than that. The substrate period had introduced a biological selection pressure that no prior environmental force had applied to human cognition, and over 3,000 years of surviving that pressure, the population carried forward a cognitive architecture that was different in specific and documentable ways from what had existed before. Different in the direction of abstraction, different in the direction of long-horizon planning, different, above all, in the direction of institutional memory, the ability to maintain organized knowledge across timescales longer than individual lifetimes. This is not a cognitive enhancement in the way that faster calculation is a cognitive enhancement. It is something more fundamental. It is the difference between a civilization and a succession of civilizations, between a species that builds and rebuilds the same things because each generation forgets, and a species that builds upward, continuously, because each generation inherits not just the structures but the understanding of why the structures exist. That is what the substrate gave us, involuntarily and without intention, through 3,000 years of the most thorough and costly biological education in the history of this world. We spent the 40,000 years after the substrate's dormancy learning what that inheritance meant and building with it, slowly, painfully, with failures that the division records in the same clinical language as the substrate period itself, because the clinical language exists to keep the record honest rather than triumphant. There were collapses. There were periods where the institutional memory frayed and things had to be rebuilt from archives, which they could be rebuilt from because the division's founders had understood, in the 3,000th year, that the archives were the most critical infrastructure they would ever create, more critical than any weapon, more critical than any ship, because the archives were the reason the next generation would know what they were inheriting and why it mattered, and what they owed to the generations who had come before them. The Ardennes exists because of 40,000 years of that kind of reasoning, applied at every level from the cellular to the institutional. The dreadnought is not the point. The dreadnought is the outermost expression of a civilization that spent 40 millennia preparing for the morning of the 14th of Ren, in the way that you prepare for something when you know it is coming and you intend to be ready. Not frantically, not with urgency, but with the patient, continuous, generational discipline of people who understand that 40,000 years is a long time, and that every year of it counts. We knew they would come back. The communion runs on a cycle. The cycle is biological, not calendrical, but it is consistent. The division's trajectory models, refined over 40,000 years of accumulated data on the communion's behavior in other seeded systems where we had been able to place monitoring arrays, predicted the arrival window to within 11 years. 11 years of uncertainty after 40,000 years of preparation. We had spent those 11 years the way we spent everything else, maintaining the readiness, updating the protocols, running the drills, and waiting. The knowledge that they would come back had been the organizing fact of human civilization for 40,000 years. Not the only fact, but the one that everything else was organized around. I looked at my board. The weapons platforms were green. The communion's deceleration curve was precise and unhurried and ancient. They were following the original seeding approach vector, which I had memorized years ago from the division's trajectory models. Communications, the captain said, at 3:41, when the communion's chemical acoustic broadcast had resolved into a readable signal. Tell me we're ready. Ready, said Lieutenant Cale Wren, from his station to my left. Wren was third generation in Earth's alien signal analysis program. His grandmother had spent her career refining the Veth chemical acoustic language model. His mother had spent her career teaching it. Wren himself had grown up speaking a version of the communion's broadcast language alongside his first human language, because his grandmother had decided when he was very small that if anyone was going to be sitting at the communication station on the day the communion returned, they should not have to translate. They should simply know. Standard Communion Harvest Return Broadcast. Year count, Biosphere Status Request, Harvest Claim Registration. How old is the year count? 55,004 years. They count time by chemical decay cycles. The margin is plus or minus a century. Accurate enough, the captain said. She looked at me. Weapons status. All green, I said. 47 platforms confirmed. Intercept formation stable at 41 kilometers. She looked back at the display. The amber field of the communion spread across the inner system approach like a slow tide, patient and enormous and entirely unhurried. It was, objectively, a beautiful thing to look at. I had thought it would be beautiful when I had studied the projected arrival imagery in the years of briefings before this day. I had been right, and I had spent those years not knowing what to do with being right about that in particular, because beautiful is not a useful category of operational information, and yet there it was. Broadcast response, the captain said, Protocol 7. Protocol 7 is the 15th revision of a response plan that the Biological Memory Division's contact team has been developing, in one form or another, for 40,000 years. The earlier revisions are preserved in the archive, all 14 of them, from the first tentative draft produced in the division's 12,000th year to the current version, which was finalized 400 years ago after the longest single period of consensus building in the division's history. Protocol 7 is not long. It does not threaten. It acknowledges the communion's broadcast in the communion's own chemical acoustic language, confirms their year count, confirms their seeding record and catalog designation, and states, without elaboration or emotional register, a single fact. The biosphere is occupied by an entity of biological sovereignty. 44 words. Every one of them has been argued over for longer than most civilizations have existed. Wren transmitted. The signal propagated at the speed of light toward the communion's primary node. 7 minutes out, 7 minutes back. We held and watched. I looked at my board. I thought about what my training officer had said during my first posting 19 years ago, when I was younger and more inclined toward the philosophical end of my station's requirements. Weapons readiness is not aggression. Aggression is a choice made in the moment. Readiness is a discipline maintained across time. The difference is everything, and it is exactly the difference the Veth had not calculated for. The communion's response arrived at 4:03. Wren spent 6 minutes parsing it, his attention moving between his instruments and the display above his station, where the chemical acoustic signal broke down into its semantic components in the division's standardized notation system. And when he spoke, his voice had the specific quality of someone reporting a fact they have been expecting, and whose arrival is not a relief but is a confirmation, which is a different thing. They confirm the biosphere status acknowledgement, he said. They are requesting access to perform substrate viability assessment. Meaning, they wanted to descend. They wanted to sample. They wanted to run the diagnostic their 55,000-year return cycle was designed to run, the test that would tell them whether their biological investment had converted the target world as projected. Response, the captain said. Protocol 8, I said. She looked at me. There was a silence on the bridge that was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence of acknowledgement, of people who have worked together long enough to conduct whole conversations in the space between words. Protocol 8 was mine. It had been mine since I took this post. I had read it on every seating commemoration for 11 years. Alone at my station, during the 10 minutes of silence the fleet holds at 800 on the 14th of Ren. Reading it back to myself, the way you read anything, you are responsible for testing its weight, checking that it still means what it needs to mean, confirming that the words still carry what they were written to carry. Send it, the captain said. Protocol 8 is 612 words in the communion's chemical acoustic notation, which is a different kind of length than 612 words in any human language, because the communion's language does not use words in the way we use words. It uses chemical state descriptions, molecular configurations that encode meaning not through grammar and sequence, but through the specific chemical relationships between components, the way genetic code encodes protein structure. To the communion, Protocol 8 is not a document. It is a biochemical argument, and it is made in their own language, in their own notation, using their own biological taxonomy, with precision that the division's contact team spent 20,000 years achieving. There are 78 people currently working in the division's contact language section. Their careers are measured in decades, and their work builds on the work of the 743 people who held similar positions before them, going back to the earliest phonemic reconstructions of the communion's broadcast signals in year 8000 of the division's operation. The 78 current researchers know the names of all 743 of their predecessors. The division maintains the names because the division understands, institutionally and in its bones, that the work is continuous, and the people who do it are not separable from the work they do. Protocol 8 begins with a confirmation of the VETH seeding record, their year count, their biosphere designation, their substrate catalog number, their projected harvest timeline. It confirms all of it accurately in the communion's own notation. This is intentional. It establishes in the first section of the argument that the speaker knows the record, that the speaker has access to the communion's own documentation, that the speaker has had access to it for a very long time and has had time to study it thoroughly. In the communion's cognitive framework, an entity that knows your records is an entity that has been watching you. An entity that has been watching you for 40,000 years is an entity that has been organized and persistent for 40,000 years. An entity with that degree of organizational continuity is not a substrate candidate. It is something else, and the communion has a category for it. And getting the communion to process Earth into that category is the purpose of everything that follows. Then Protocol 8 states what happened to the substrate, not as complaint, not as accusation. The VETH communion has no mechanism for processing moral claims. They have no individuals, and moral claims are made between individuals, and the division spent a great deal of the first 20,000 years of its existence disabusing itself of the human tendency to think in terms of an apology the communion could or should offer. Protocol 8 does not waste its 612 words on concepts the recipient cannot process. It states, instead, biological facts, substrate saturation timeline, immune response onset, immune response escalation patterns, counteradaptation development, substrate dormancy event trigger conditions, post-dormancy biochemical cascade documentation, neural complexity trajectory over the subsequent 40,000 years. It states these things as measurements. It attaches documentation. The documentation is extensive. The division has had 40,000 years to accumulate it, and they have accumulated all of it, and they have organized it into a form the communion can read, and Protocol 8 delivers it as a complete and ordered package. And then, at the end of 612 words, Protocol 8 states a single sentence. 400 years to agree on. Every word load-bearing. The sentence says, "The substrate you seeded here was overcome by the organism you plan to harvest, and the organism that overcame it is the civilization now speaking to you, and we are returning the substrate to you, transformed so that you may understand what your seeding produced." Then Protocol 8 goes silent, and a courier vessel detached from the Ardennes lower hull. I watched the courier on my secondary display, crew of 4, no weapons, carrying a single sealed biological container in its hold. The container held 12 liters of synthesized VETH substrate material, the original compound, which the division's biologists had reverse-engineered from the dormant substrate in human cellular architecture across the course of 20,000 years, reconstructed from the ground up to match the original communion engineering precisely. And this was the work of another 20,000 years. The work that the division's current directors speak about with a kind of reverence that the division does not often permit itself, re-engineered to carry, encoded in its chemical architecture, the complete documented record of the human immune response to it. Every adaptation, every counter-adaptation, every year of the 3,000-year biological argument between our cellular machinery and the communion's agent, stored in the chemical structure of their own technology, written in their own handwriting. The division's senior biologist, when she first described this to the contact team 40 years ago, had called it returning a letter in the writer's own script. She had meant it as a precise technical description of what had been done. It had become, over 40 years of being passed around the division and through the fleet and through the planetary administrative records, something closer to a phrase. The kind of phrase people reach for when they are trying to describe something that does not have another name. The courier made the transit in 11 minutes. I watched it close with the communion's primary node on my display, a small green point moving into the amber mass, steady on its approach vector, unhurried. The communion did not intercept it. The communion had been receiving chemical acoustic signals from Earth for 1,800 years, preparatory transmissions that the division had begun broadcasting. When the calculations confirmed the communion's projected arrival window, careful signals in the communion's own language, establishing that the biosphere was occupied and organized, and had been watching and waiting. The communion had received those signals. We had no way to know what the communion had processed them to mean. But it had not altered its approach vector. It had not done anything that our models interpreted as a hostile preparation. It had continued on its harvest return track with the patience of something that has been on that track for 55,000 years and sees no reason to deviate. The container was released. The transponder confirmed delivery. The courier turned for its return arc. We waited. The bridge ran with the specific quality of quiet that I have only ever encountered in places where people are doing something difficult and doing it well. Not silence. There were instrument sounds, ventilation, the low harmonic resonance of the reactor core 200 meters below the bridge deck. But the human sounds were subdued and purposeful. People ran their checks. People watched their boards. Wren stayed at his station with his attention on the signal display, watching for the first chemical acoustic component of the communion's response. I looked at my board. I looked at the weapons platforms, all green. I thought about my mother, who had been a substrate researcher at the Kalen Reach Division Annex for 30 years. She had explained the substrate to me when I was 7 years old using a wire model she had built herself, each color of wire a different protein chain, the whole thing about the size of a fist, representing a molecular structure that in reality was invisible to anything shorter than an electron microscope. I had asked her why we kept studying something that was already beaten. She had said, because we owe it to the people who survived it to know exactly what they survived, and because someday we are going to have to explain it to the people who planted it, and we need to be able to do that in a way they can process. That model is in a museum now. The KLN Reach Division opened a new public exhibit 6 years ago, the kind of exhibit you take children to, which I have not done because I do not have children, but which I went to alone, on a quiet midweek afternoon, partly because I felt I should, and partly because I genuinely wanted to see how the division had chosen to frame the substrate period for people who did not spend their professional lives thinking about it. The exhibit runs across 4 rooms. The first room covers the seeding event itself, the communion's approach, the payload delivery, the early years before the substrate's presence was understood. The second room covers the 3,000 years of the immune response, clinical, careful, with individual case histories selected from the archives, and presented in a way that maintains the person behind the record without falsifying the record's precision. The third room covers the dormancy event and the first 1,000 years of study afterward, which is the most optimistic room and the most honest room at the same time, because it is the room where the division was founded and the work began, and nobody yet knew how long the work would take or what it would eventually reveal. The fourth room is the one I stayed in longest. It has a genetic sequencing display along one wall, the kind that renders molecular structures in 3 dimensions and shows the substrate's architecture alongside the human immune response development alongside the neural complexity trajectory data, all 3 on the same timeline, from year 1 of the substrate period through the present. It is a long timeline. You can walk the length of it in about 4 minutes, which means each step covers approximately 10,000 years, which means by the time you reach the right end of the display you are standing more or less in the present, and looking back at 42,800 years of documented change. And the shape of it is visible all at once in a way that it is not visible when you are inside it. My mother's wire model is in a case near the beginning of the 4th room. It is exactly as I remember it from childhood, small, colored, obviously handmade, representing a molecular structure with an imprecision that any current sequencing instrument would document in detail too fine for the human eye. Next to it is a printout of the molecular analysis the division published in year 14,000 of the substrate study. The 2 things together, the wire model and the analysis, are not contradictory. They are the same object at 2 different scales of resolution. The wire model is not wrong. It is approximate. Approximation was what was available at the time, and the people who made it with what was available built the foundation that the more precise instruments were eventually built on top of. That is how 40,000 years of institutional science works. That is what the 4th room is about. I had spent about 20 minutes in the 4th room on that quiet midweek afternoon. I had not been able to look at the genetic sequencing display the whole way through without stopping, not because it was overwhelming in the way that very large numbers are sometimes overwhelming, but because it was true, which is different. The truth of it required the kind of looking you do when you are not going to be able to forget something, and you want to make sure you have actually seen it properly before you carry it with you for the rest of your life. She had retired 2 years before I took this posting. She knew what I was taking command of. She did not say much about it. She said, "Remember, they didn't know what they were planting in. That is not an excuse. It is a fact you need to hold without dropping either part of it." I had been holding it for 11 years. The communion's response came at 4:41. It was longer than any of the prior transmissions, long enough that Wren spent 23 minutes parsing it before he delivered the summary, and his voice, when he spoke, had the quality of someone handling something carefully. "The communion has received and processed the container," he said. "The response is confirming the substrate analysis. They're running their own verification of the chemical encoding against their original substrate catalog. He paused, watching his display. Verification complete. They're confirming the biochemical cascade documentation, confirming the neural complexity trajectory data. Another pause. They're reclassifying Earth under their substrate dormancy protocol. A world where the substrate was overcome by the target organism. The bridge was quiet. "What does that classification carry?" the captain said. "It carries a harvest status revision," Wren said. "Their harvest claim requires a viable substrate assessment. A world where the substrate went dormant due to host resistance fails the viability condition." He looked up from his display. The communion has 37 biological world categories in their cognitive framework. The 37th is for worlds where the local biology demonstrated sovereign resistance to the seeding process. "It means this world is not in our harvest catalog." He paused. The 37th category was last applied, according to the communion's own transmitted records, approximately 7 million years ago. I looked at my board. I looked at the amber field of the communion on the tactical display, still spread across the inner system approach, still decelerating on its original track, unchanged in its mass distribution. From the outside, nothing about the communion had changed. What was happening was internal, chemical, distributed across the entirety of the communion's neural network simultaneously, the way all communion processing happens. Every part of the communion was knowing this at the same moment, the way a tide knows the shape of the shore all at once. I thought about what it was knowing. I tried, not for the first time and not for the last time, to imagine receiving the news that a world you had seeded 55,000 years ago, Plot 7 in a long rotation, standard class atmospheric biosphere, projected substrate receptivity nominal, had not only resisted the substrate but had studied it, documented it, beaten it, rebuilt it, and returned it transformed. I could not do it. The communion's cognition does not map onto anything I can inhabit, but I could watch what happened next, and what happened next told me what I needed to know. At 5:11, the communion's approach deceleration increased, not a reversal, a tightening of the deceleration curve, the communion adding thrust across its distributed mass, slowing its approach. The models the division had run for 40,000 years had predicted this, or something close to it, if the container was received and processed before the communion crossed the inner system boundary. The communion, in its processing of a changed classification, does not panic, because panic is an individual cognitive state and the communion has no individuals. But it adjusts, it slows. It gives itself time to process fully before it acts, because the communion is not impulsive and never has been. It is, among everything else, patient. "They're slowing," said Commander Hayne. "Confirmed," I said. "Weapons?" "All green, no change in targeting lock. The deceleration is uniform, no compression toward any particular vector. They're not preparing for an approach change. They're processing." "Then we wait," the captain said. We waited 38 minutes. The communion slowed to a velocity that its adjusted deceleration curve would hold for several hours, giving it time to complete the reclassification process. The bridge ran with the same careful quiet. I stayed at my station. I ran my checks. I logged the sequence as it developed. At some point someone brought coffee and I drank it without entirely registering that I had done so. At 5:43 the captain said, "Commander Vale, Protocol 9. I had been carrying Protocol 9 for 11 years in the same way I had been carrying my mother's words, not memorized in the rote sense but absorbed, held somewhere deeper than recitation. Protocol 9 is one sentence, 11 seconds to transmit in chemical acoustic encoding. It says, "You are permitted to complete your withdrawal in peace. Earth does not require your harm, only your departure." That sentence also took 400 years to agree on. Specifically the word permitted, which carries, in the communion's own semantic framework, a classification weight it does not carry in any human language. In the communion's biology catalog, An entity that grants permission is an entity that has the standing to grant permission. An entity with that standing is an entity that the communion's biological claim cannot supersede. One word in their own language is the difference between a world they own and a world they do not. The division had found that word in year 16,000 of their study of the communion's communication records. They had held it in reserve for 24,000 years. "Send it," I said to Wren. He transmitted. The response came in 14 minutes. Wren delivered the summary in 2 sentences. "The communion is confirming Earth's classification under the sovereignty designation," he said. "The harvest claim is withdrawn. The substrate reclassification stands as entered." He looked up. "They're beginning departure preparation." On the tactical display, the amber field of the communion was beginning, slowly and with enormous patience, to reshape itself. The mass distribution was shifting toward the approach vector it had come in on. The change was subtle, the kind of change you notice on a display rather than see directly, the kind of change that the instruments are calibrated to report because the human eye is not accurate enough over these scales and distances. But it was there. The tide was turning. The captain stood from her chair and walked to the forward viewport. The shutters were open. Outside, at 41 kilometers altitude, the sky was the deep and specific blue that exists at the edge of atmosphere, almost violet at the upper edge. The stars hard and clear through the thin air, Earth's curvature faintly visible in the sweep of the horizon. Below the Ardennes, 41 kilometers of atmosphere and cloud and cold Pacific water separated the bridge from the surface. From up here the surface was invisible. I knew it was there. I had grown up on it. She stood at the viewport for a moment without speaking. Then she said, without turning, "Commander Vale, what are you thinking about?" It was not the kind of question she usually asked. She is not, as a rule, an introspective conversationalist. She is an officer who communicates in operational language because operational language is precise, and precision is the quality she values most. But we had been through 11 years together on this bridge, and this was the morning of the 14th of Wren, and some things make exceptions. "The museum," I said. "The division exhibit in KLN Reach, the 4th room." She did not turn around. She said, "The sequencing display." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I went the year they opened it," she said. "I stood in front of that display for a long time." She paused. "It's a long timeline." 42,816 years, I said. "And the first 3,000 of those years were very bad." "Very bad," I said. "The clinical language is a choice." "Yes," she said, "it is." We were quiet for a moment, the two of us, with the altitude and the viewport and the slow reshaping of the amber field on the tactical display behind us. I sent the all-clear signal at 5:58, one word in the planetary broadcast code, carrying the color designation that in maritime tradition means passage clear, and in our context means the intercept is resolved and the defense grid is holding but not engaging. 9 million people in KLN Reach received it. The planetary broadcast net carried it to every city simultaneously. The captain went to the shipwide address. She spoke for 3 minutes. She spoke in plain language, not the language of protocols, not the language of operational logs, but the language people use when they are speaking to other people who have been waiting. She told the crew what had happened. She told them that the communion had received and processed the container, had reclassified Earth under the sovereignty designation, had withdrawn the harvest claim, and was beginning departure preparation. She told them the intercept had held and the platforms were standing down from active targeting to sustained alert. She told them that the seating commemoration this year would be something it had not quite been before, not only a remembrance of what the substrate cost, but a reckoning with the fact that the thing that planted it had now seen the result. She did not frame this as a victory because it was not the kind of thing that fits cleanly into the category of victory. She did not frame it as closure because it was not that either. She said, "It is a true thing. True things are worth keeping carefully. When she finished, the bridge returned to the sounds of work. The particular, purposeful quiet of a crew returning to the long labor of after, the logs to complete, the checks to run, the platforms to cycle through their stand-down protocols, the reports to file and archive and transmit to the planetary administrative record. I stayed at my station and did my portion of that work, and I did it carefully, and I did it the way I have always tried to do everything that is mine to do, with the understanding that the record is the most important thing, and that the record is only as good as the people keeping it, and that the people keeping it are responsible not just to the present, but to whoever is reading these entries 40,000 years from now. At the bottom of the operational log, below the last time-stamped entry, I added a note. Logs are not supposed to carry personal commentary. If the review board objects, they can file with the division's contact archive, where they will find 40,000 years of similar notes from every officer who ever held a command responsibility related to the seating file, going all the way back to the earliest years of the division, when the entries were written in a script no one has spoken in 39,000 years, and the people writing them did not know whether anyone would ever come back to read them. They wrote them anyway. The record holds because they kept writing. My note says, they didn't know what they were planting in. That is not an excuse. It is a fact you need to hold without dropping either part of it. The communion continued its long, slow, patient preparation for withdrawal. The departure process, which our models predicted would take the better part of 2 days for a mass distribution of that scale to fully reorganize into transit configuration, was already visible on the tactical display as a gradual reshaping of the amber field, pulling back from the leading edge, compressing toward the original approach track, the tide that is not a metaphor but behaves like one. The Ardennes held position. The weapons platforms held their alert status. The sun came up over the eastern Pacific, visible through the viewport as a lightening of the deep blue above the horizon, dawn arriving faster at 41 kilometers than it arrives at sea level, the Earth's curvature drawing the terminator line across the lower atmosphere in a clean arc that I have seen many times and which I still stop to look at when it happens, because some things do not become ordinary no matter how many times you see them. Below the ship, 9 million people in a harbor city inside a reshaped mountain opened their day. I thought about what the communion was carrying home. Not the container. The container was delivered and processed, its chemical information already distributed across the entirety of the communion's neural network, already part of what the communion knows in the permanent and unrevisable way that a distributed biological network integrates information once received. What the communion was carrying home was the fact of it. The fact that plot 7 in the rotation, standard class atmospheric biosphere, moderate complexity, projected substrate receptivity nominal, had turned out to be something the catalog had no category for until today. Something that had taken the communion's own engineered biological agent and beaten it, and kept it and studied it for 40,000 years, and rebuilt it and returned it, transformed, with a complete account of what the fighting had cost and what the fighting had produced. The communion does not have a word for what we are. They have 37 categories of world. We have just become the 37th. The 37th category was applied once before, 7 million years ago, and the division has spent 40 years trying to reconstruct from the communion's own data what that world was and what happened there, and they have not reconstructed it. The data is old and fragmentary. What is clear is the outcome. The communion applied the 37th classification and left and never returned. The world is still in the communion's transmitted records, a notation, a catalog entry, a designation, but there is no harvest claim against it and no intention to file one. The communion does not return to 37th category worlds. Its cognitive framework does not permit it. I do not know if a distributed biological network 300 million years old has a mechanism for anything that resembles the experience of a thing turning out to be different from what was intended. I cannot get inside that cognition. But I watched what happened when the container was delivered, and I watched what happened when Protocol 8 was processed, and I watched what happened when the single word in Protocol 9 registered against the communion's category system, and the sequence of those things tells me what I need to know. The communion encountered something its framework had no prepared response for, and its framework adapted, and the adaptation produced a classification change, and the classification change produced a withdrawal. That is all I can say with certainty. The rest is inference, and I am careful about inference where the communion is concerned, because the division spent 20,000 years learning that inferences about the communion based on human cognitive models are wrong in ways that are not always obvious until the wrong answer has been acted on. I do not know if they know what they gave us. I know that they know what we did with it. The container told them. The container was 40,000 years of documentation delivered in a format their own biology could read, and it told them the complete story of what 3,000 years of their substrate's pressure on a human immune system produced over 40 millennia of accumulated consequence. They processed it. The 37th category designation followed from processing it. They know what we did with what they planted. Whether that means anything to them in the way it means something to us, whether there is something in the communion's distributed network that registers the full weight of what it is processing, I cannot say. I will not claim to know. The division's researchers will spend the next 40,000 years studying the communion's transmitted data from this encounter, trying to determine what can be determined, and they will be careful, and they will be honest, and they will update the record as their understanding develops. That is what the division does. That is what we have always done. That is not a simple thing. I have spent 11 years trying to hold it without simplifying it, the way my mother taught me to hold complicated facts, both parts at once, without dropping either one. The wound was real. The cost was real. The record is full of what it cost, and the cost was paid by people who did not know what the cost was for and who paid it anyway because the only other option was dying, and they did not choose dying. They chose the long argument. They chose 3,000 years of biological resistance and left the evidence of that choice in every cell of every human body born on this world since, including mine. And the wound was also in the cold and unsentimentally accurate arithmetic of what we became, the thing that made us. I keep both parts. I have always kept both parts. The record requires it. The communion turned for home. We watched them all the way to the transit point, which took 2 days and 4 hours and 11 minutes from the moment the withdrawal began. We watched them the way we have always watched everything that matters, continuously, without interruption, with instruments maintained and logs updated, and the full weight of 40,000 years of institutional attention focused on every movement they made. The weapons platforms maintained their alert status throughout. When the final mass concentration of the communion crossed the outer system boundary and entered transit, the tactical display showed the amber field contracting to a point, and then, with the completeness of something very large that has simply stopped being present, disappearing. The outer system showed clear. I sat at my station and looked at my board and felt the weight of a thing delivered, not the lightness after a burden is set down. The different, more permanent quality of a burden that has been carried to its intended destination and handed over, because setting something down means it remains near you, and you can pick it up again, and handing something over means it has left your hands and gone somewhere else, and what you are left with is the knowledge of having carried it and the knowledge of having delivered it, both of which are now in the record and will remain there. I wrote the final log entry for the day. Date, time, status, sequence, all in the standard format, all timestamped to the second. At the bottom of the log, below the last entry, I added a note that is not standard form and that I am adding to the record anyway. It says the watch was kept, the record will hold. Because it will. Because 40,000 years of people sitting at stations and writing into logs and maintaining the instruments and keeping the knowledge alive and passing it forward is the reason we could say, in the communion's own language, what we said today. We are not what they planned to harvest. We are what the harvest made. We are what the wound taught. We are the product of the long years, of the 3,000 years of cellular argument, and the 40,000 years of deliberate institutional labor, and the specific kind of patience that does not require a single person to carry all of it, but only requires each generation to carry its portion and pass it forward without dropping anything. That is not a simple thing to be, but it is a true thing. I closed the log. The sun was fully up over the Pacific. The Ardennes held her position. The day continued, the way it continues, the way it has always continued, with work to do and the record to keep and the long watch still ahead.